Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Creeping Shadow, Book 4 of Lockwood Company by Jonathan Stroud. Okay, so yeah, this is the fourth Lockwood Company book, and I'm super excited to talk about this one. But I do want to warn you, like usual, I'm talking about a book that's pretty far along in a series. There will be spoilers for the first 3 books. If you have not read them and plan on reading them, be aware that, yeah, you might learn some things in this review that you might not want to know yet. But this book starts with Lucy working as a freelance consultant, hiring herself out to whichever company wants to work with her. She hasn't really seen Lockwood, George, or Holly in months, but when Lockwood shows up asking to hire her for one job, she's still pretty wary. She's still worried that she and Lockwood drive each other to dangerous places when they work together, and therefore she's not really keen on it, but she takes the job. Soon she'll be tangled in the company, the people, and the cases again. Somehow they will end up investigating a cannibal ghost, a haunted relics black market, a cursed town, and might end up setting themselves against the 2 biggest agencies in the country. They will need all their skills, and plus a few more, to survive this tangle of cases. So, because I summarized the damn thing, I want to start with the plotting of this book. And I just want to say that these books in general, the entire Lockwood & Company series, every last one of them, has been really unusual when it comes to plotting. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the plotting. The intensity, the strong rhythms in the plotting are the things that I think are the strongest in these books. This is the reason I keep picking this series up book after book, is because they are the kind of books that I used to refer to as crack books. You start reading and it's really hard to stop because you just want to know what's happening next. These are books that you sort of almost expect them, when you think about them, to have the rhythm of a mystery novel, where there's like one case that gets solved across the book, and there might be little clues that something else will happen later on, but it's one case. Everything that's in the book is that one case, one and done, just that. But nope, that's not what Lockwood & Company books are doing. I already mentioned in one of my previous reviews that the books always start with a case that is largely unrelated to the overall arc of the story, but it's just going to get finished in the first couple of chapters, and Stroud really uses it to introduce the world, where the characters are at emotionally, the themes, and the level of horror and action that you can expect for the rest of the book. And I think it's a really brilliant choice, because it does drop you into action right away, which means that you are, like, engaged right away. It gives you time to get that character and world building in a situation that it doesn't really matter as much if the reader does not catch all the nuances, because that first case is largely its own thing. It does not have as much to do with the rest of the plot, and therefore if you miss something, it's not that detrimental to the rest of your understanding of the book. But also, it's an incredibly useful trick for a YA book, because these books are for YA, and if you look at just the characters' ages, which is what a lot of people in the industry look at, the characters start at 15 and 16, which means that, yeah, the readers are intended to be like 13 and 14-year-olds. And not every 13 and 14-year-old is going to be up to these books. Both prose-wise, they are somewhat linguistically complicated, but also the level of gore and violence and horror here is stronger than some 13-year-olds would want. And that first couple of chapters, that first case, gives you a little preview. Basically, it's a short story that you can read and figure out, am I going to be up to the Lockwood books? But what I've talked about less is that the rest of the books also are not just one case. Like, there is usually a dominant case that they are working on and that all the others end up getting mixed up in, but they are usually doing 3 to 4 cases in each book. And that leads to the book being a series of inciting incidents, rising actions, climax, falling action, then another inciting incident, another rising action, climax, falling action, another inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and over again. And, like, sometimes most of the time, there is some overlap in them. So, like, a good example is from this book. The culminating case is actually one that had its inciting incident in the middle of the rising action of case 3. And then it's set aside for, like, 30 pages. Something else gets wrapped up, so we get some more rising action, we get a little bit of a climax, and we come back to it again during the rising action of the last case. And it gets its own rising action that gets totally intermingled with the climax of the last case, and these last two cases end up perfectly intermingled by the end. But they start as two separate cases, and it's all just really complex plotting. And I think that Jonathan Stroud handles this incredibly complex plotting insanely well. He manages to interweave all these different stories in a way that we as a reader can tell that they are all connected, but it mostly makes sense that the characters don't realize it. It doesn't feel like they are just ignoring the obvious connections, but also it doesn't feel forced to the reader. Because I will admit, sometimes when you have these books that have like 15 plots that slowly intermingle and interweave, they either start out feeling so disconnected that you're just like, what? Or the other option is it feels a little bit like the after-school specials that we all watched in the 90s, when there'd be one episode that was like, oh my god, all the different characters are going to have an arc that revolves around them rejecting drugs. And they somehow all manage to have the exact same trouble in the exact same week. But this instead feels like it just happens to be part of a bigger story, and it makes sense that everything ends up being part of it because there's such a big story going on. But also that does make it wildly difficult to blurb these books. Like, to give it a little synopsis that tells you what the action is going to be like without revealing things is insanely hard, because objectively, the inciting incident for the entire book, what really gets the plot moving, is about a third of the way through the book. And, like, a lot of the, like, overarching story of this book is stuff that is revealed early on. So it would be spoilers to tell you, like, that's what's gonna happen. But also, it creates an overall book that feels a little bit like a roller coaster of a read. There's a lot of ups and downs, and I think it really masters how many ups and downs there needs to be, because the thing about tension that a lot of people, I feel like, get a little bit wrong. I've seen a lot of reviews where people talk about, like, oh, they used comedy to destroy the tension and to make it just more palatable and less tense to read, and I'm like, no, that's not what's happening. Comedy undercutting tension, what it's doing is it's allowing that tension to start building again. And yeah, when it's placed in the wrong place, it destroys everything. But a well-plotted arc is not going to be constantly rising tension. There are going to need to be some down moments, some calm moments, some funny moments. And that back and forth is what makes things feel really tense and strong. And I feel like the Lockwood Company books do this in spades. Now, that being said, because as a reader it is intensely obvious that it's all going to come together and everything is going to be important eventually, there are a couple of big reveals that are super obvious really early on. Like, I mentioned that the culminating case has its inciting incident, like, early in the book. Like, it's, you know, pretty early, and it's during another event. And there is a point when Lockwood realizes that, oh, that relates to everything else. But it's like 30, 50, somewhere like that, pages further on. And throughout all that time, I guarantee you most of the readers are going, oh my god, yeah, it's that other case. You remember that other case? It's that case you just dismissed. It's that case. But it does make sense for the characters not to have realized it, because they're busy and in danger and have a lot going on, but also because they do not have the insight that we readers have, that the author would not have included that random beginning of a case if it weren't going to be important to the overarching story. But because of all that, because it's so long before we get back to it, it does feel like you're reading for quite a while, being like, are y'all ever gonna figure this out? But plotting aside, this has been my favorite Lockwood Company book so far for a couple of reasons. Namely, the prose and the characters. Now, I talked in previous reviews about how perfectly these books walk the line between giving us enough description that everything is gloriously creepy without ever feeling like it's giving you too much for a YA book, or for the slightly comedic tone that they weave in and out throughout the story. And yeah, that is still there. That is part of what I'm talking about. But also, Lucy herself has gotten a hell of a lot more introspective as the series has progressed, and because she is our POV character, the prose itself is just getting more and more elegant, thematic, and thoughtful. This book is absolutely beautiful to read. And it's honestly such strong prose in the beginning that I was beginning to feel like maybe it was a mistake, because it felt too complex, both for the younger range of YA that this book is sort of aimed at. Like, I do feel like some of the, like, 13 to 14-year-olds that might be reading this book might struggle with some of the language, but also just, this didn't feel like the Lucy we'd met in previous books. Like, the Lucy we met in book 1 through 3 is slightly shallow, very envious, and angry. And in this book, she's been almost completely subsumed by this slightly more thoughtful, noir, heartbeat, and detective kind of version of Lucy. And in the beginning, I was like, that is weird. And then I read on, and more it just made sense. Lucy has been largely isolated for the last few months. She broke off her connections with her friends for what she felt was for their own good, and now she really only has a relationship with a possibly evil Skull. She has matured, and specifically, she has become more morose, less focused on the physical appearances, and more introspective, because these are things that happen when you're super isolated for a while. She's just had a lot of time to think about herself, think about what she feels, think about what she does, and she has just come to know herself better. And a good example of this is in the beginning, when Lucy would talk about why, or think about why she left Lockwood Company, I was struggling to decide as a reader, is this her being an unreliable narrator? Is Stroud trying to retcon the events and basically rewrite the end and make it more, heroic that she left? Because I 100% did believe at the end of the last book that Lucy mostly left Lockwood Company because of Holly, and everything else was just sort of an excuse. And this book does two things that I feel like changes that from being a possible flaw to becoming such a strength of the book. First, it has numerous characters straight out call Lucy on this. Straight up tell her, I thought you left because of Holly. And the first couple of times she blows it off, but eventually Lucy has to explain herself, has to come to terms with what Holly meant and why she had that reaction to Holly, and straight up explain what's really going on. And she admits that, yes, Holly brought everything to the surface, but there were things happening behind the scenes from quite a while before. And the book also shows us these little interactions here and there that build up to a real emotional journey Lucy is having about how she feels about Lockwood and her, and how they drive each other to be more wildly reckless, and how that is dangerous, and what her responsibility with it is. And Lucy, also how she feels about Holly, has the same sort of gradual buildup. We get these little scenes here and there that show us that, yeah, Lucy did sort of hate Holly for being so well put together, but it wasn't about her being jealous of the pretty girl who always looks so nice. That was just a symptom of the fact that she hated the fact that Holly was more perfectly in control than she ever was. And it all comes down to being out of control. And because the version of Lucy that we see in this book is a lot more in control, and we know why she's become a lot more in control, it does allow us to look back on the previous events and go, oh yeah, she wasn't lying to herself. That really was what was going on. And basically, it feels like Lucy just did a lot of work on herself between books. And in her time alone, she's come to know herself a lot better. And I think the book actually shows it really, really well. And that's hard to do. And then there's Kips. I'll admit, Kips was one of my favorite characters in the last couple of books. Like, yeah, in book 1 he's slightly annoying, but over time his rivalry with Lockwood begins to feel significantly more like it's on the verge of turning into friendship. And I watched a lot of anime as a teenager, so that we are fighting to the death and now we're besties arc is one that is ingrained in my mind. But I think Stroud did it in a way that feels very organic. It does feel like those two kids in school that are constantly competing for the best grades, and they, snip at each other, but you can tell that they really care about each other. And what Stroud did with the character of Kips in the last book, oh my god, everything about it was absolutely gorgeous. Like his fading ability and the way it was used to talk about the loss of the previous versions of ourselves that you experience as you grow up. It was amazing, and it made him my absolute favorite part of the Hollow Boy. Like, I loved Kip's there, and I loved the emotional connection that he made with the others in that book. It was just so beautifully done, and especially in a book that up until that point was feeling relatively, you know, fun, lighthearted, silly, but there's this deep emotional core there. And so I was fucking ecstatic to see him coming back in this one, and I love the way he's worked in. I love the way his character development is shown physically and actively, and I love how he begins to fit in with the others and how he feels like a perfect foil for Lockwood, and how you can see his place in this world, and the kindness behind the rivalries and animosity that he comes to represent in this series is just spectacular. Because if there's one thing about this series that I've never really liked, it's how mean-spirited almost everyone is. They are always insulting each other, always doing petty things, getting in petty fights, and Lucy's description of people has always been just, for a lack of a better word, mean. But gradually we've seen across the series that there is kindness behind some of this meanness. We start to see how much of it is just teasing, and that they really do see each other as family and care about each other. And in counterpoint to that, we see that some of the characters that have come across as welcoming and kind are actually the cruel ones who don't care at all about anyone else. And it builds into this theme of reversing, of kids having to take on the role of protector while the adults are helpless, life and death in life, the heroes who may never have been heroes in the first place, the ones who seem most alive being the ones who have the most obvious death wish. It's all just thematically working together in an absolutely beautiful way, and in a lot of ways I feel like it's mostly represented by Kip's. But just another random small thing, I loved the introduction in this book to the fact that there are people who still somehow don't believe in ghosts, even while people around them are being killed. And it's a tiny little detail, and it's played for comedy in this one, but there's something really deeply interesting in this. And it's all just a really great little reminder of how this world is sort of new. Like, yes, most of the current adults did grow up seeing ghosts, but their parents didn't. And it makes the problem feel very entrenched, but at the same time fixable, which is, I assume, what we all assume the series is eventually going towards, fixing the problem. But it also shows how just a couple of generations ago it was a different world, which makes for this really interesting interplay of how things change so completely, so quickly. But I do also want to talk about two small problems with the book. Once again, there was a lot more association between fatness and the grotesque in this book than I like to see. Like, the cannibal ghost is fascinating. He was a really cool, interestingly described ghost. And if he were the only example of being overweight being associated with the horror and the evil, I wouldn't have mentioned it. But this series has a habit of showing us someone is intimidating and evil and possibly grotesque by showing us that they are broad, overweight, or heavy. And I'm just sort of like, okay, I'd prefer us leave that one behind. But the other thing is the exoticism. It's not the worst I've ever seen by any stretch of the imagination, but the general tone everyone takes when talking about Lockwood's parents' research in New Guinea reminded me a bit too much of the way Sherlock Holmes books stories talk about other cultures. Like, there's all this talk about witch doctors, and there's abject shock that these quote-unquote primitive societies got anything right, and it all just feels a little bit icky. Other than those moments, I would say this is definitely the strongest Lockwood book as of yet. It is beautifully written, emotional, asks some really big questions, and draws us into a series in a beautiful way. Like, if there's one thing that I love about these books, it feels like it hooks you and just draws you straight through. And the action is, as always, spectacularly written. There's enough comedy to break the tension in the right way, and it's doing it in the right way. Like, sometimes people throw comedy in just for funsies and to make it more enjoyable, and I'm fine with that. But a lot of times comedy is there specifically to break the tension so that when you get the really tense moment a few minutes later, the contrast makes it so much more stark and so much more painful. But there's also just a real heart to this book. and it's still just a really cool world that I want to know more about. I just generally really like this series, and I cannot wait to get the next one.